Alright, so I'm going to address this right at the start because I don't think people watched my last video on House Party, and instead I ended up being blanketed as someone who doesn't want sex in video games, which isn't the case at all. So, to recap what I said in the last video on House Party, I have zero problem with sex in video games. In fact, in that video, I talked about why I think sex can actually enhance games and enhance experiences when done properly. I then went on to say why I don't like House Party and why I don't think it handles sex appropriately. However, I never said that I didn't want any games like House Party to ever be on Steam. And that's the topic for today's video. So are we good? I'm not a sex-hating bigot anymore? Thank you. Awesome. So recently, the early access game House Party was removed from Steam after receiving a lot of complaints and reports on the store page. The developer has been in contact with Valve and they are currently working to get it back onto the page. Anyone who has bought the game already will still receive updates and will still have access to the game if they want to play it. The developer has since responded to this by posting a lengthy update blog post and talking about why the game was removed and what they think is the reasoning behind everything. So I want to talk about House Party again, and I want to address what the developer was saying as well as the decision to remove it from the Steam store page. Now again, to reiterate what I said in the last video, I'm not a big fan of House Party. I don't like the way it depicts sexual content, and I think that it does violate the Steam terms of service. That being said, I'm still not against House Party existing or even being on Steam if it's handled properly. Unfortunately, due to Steam's current terms of service and rules and guidelines, it does violate multiple instances of it. The first one being very obvious in that number 2, no pornography is allowed on the platform. Now this is becoming increasingly vague as visual novels and other games that include sex in them are becoming more prevalent on the storefront. So for a long time now, games have been towing the line as to what can be considered racy or sex content and what can be considered straight up pornography, and unfortunately it seems like House Party has finally crossed that line. Although that's not necessarily a bad thing, someone had to do it eventually, so we eventually had this discussion. House Party itself does feature some very graphic sex scenes, more so than anything else on Steam. We're talking fully realized first-person sex in what could be considered a pseudo-realistic environment, and the majority of quest lines in the game directly lead to a sexual act as a reward. Now again, I don't have a problem with sex in games, but House Party is clearly going further than any other game recently released on Steam. So in the sense that it offers simulated and completely uncensored sex, it's no surprise that the game received a lot of complaints and has been removed for the time being from the Steam storefront. Now that seems to be the majority of the reason that the game has currently been taken off of Steam while the developer tries to work out a way to get it back on the platform. However, I do want to bring up something I talked about in the last video as well, in that it infringes on the copyright of a variety of rather large companies. So like I said in the last video, the game currently has logos from Sony, Facebook, Hearthstone, and a variety of different iPhone apps, and that's not allowed. That is infringing on the copyright of those companies. So while the majority of the reason for the game currently being removed is due to rule number 2, rule number 6, which is content that violates the laws of any jurisdiction in which it will be available, also applies. And in these cases, I will say that the developer should be removing these logos while they have the game down because you are violating copyright. So let's pretend that copyright infringement isn't there though. It doesn't exist. Well, it does, but for the sake of this video, let's say it doesn't for a second. Does this game have a place on Steam? Currently, no, I don't believe it does, but that's not due to the game itself. It's more due to Steam's current model of their terms of service. There are many updates that could be made to accommodate more games with sex content. These updates could actually end up benefiting House Party and the plethora of other games that are being released that do have sex in them. It allows for better curation and lets you put them all together so that people who are interested in those topics have easier access to them. It would allow Steam to put these games in a specific area where they can properly curate and age-gate content, and no matter what you think as towards whether or not sex or violence is worse in video games, currently you are required to take the steps to minimize the access to people who don't want to see the content or for those who it might be unlawful for them to do so. So what I'm basically saying is Steam needs an extra store page where they can put porn games because people want porn games, and porn games aren't really that damaging to a lot of people except for the certain people that they are. I'm gonna call it Steam Red Light. A name so good even Total Biscuit likes it. Okay, so now I want to talk about the developer's response to the game being taken off of Steam because they put together a fairly well-written blog post about it, and for the most part I agree with it with a few little things that I want to touch on. It's pretty long, so I'm just gonna leave like the link to it in the description, and I'm just gonna talk about like specific parts of it, so if you want to read the whole thing, you can go do that. So in the first part of it, the developer explained that Steam had actually reached out to them about the removal, and he is working with them to resolve their concerns. Like I said at the start of the video, anyone who's bought the game already can still access it, and updates can still be released for it. So what this tells me right off the bat is that Valve isn't necessarily against having games with heavy emphasis on sex content in them. Valve historically does have a pretty open door policy to a lot of games on Steam. However, like I said before, this one kind of takes it a step further than we've really seen. After that is where I do have a bit of a difference in opinion with that of the developer. So he goes on to say that House Party was temporarily removed as a result of a number of complaints that were sent to Steam about the game. He says the game has been a target for a certain group of people since the day it launched, and said people were posting very aggressive, distasteful, and hateful comments directed towards the game and its community of players. I suspect the complaints about the game that Steam received were originating from the same groups. Steam agreed to let the game back on the site after some modifications, which we are working on right now. They have generously offered me the opportunity to modify the game for readmission to their service. Now, I was rather involved with the community discussions on House Party, and I wrote up a very lengthy review as well as making my video for it. I can say for certain that there was a big degree of harassment going on about the game because of its depiction of sexual content and some of the content within the game itself. And this did in fact lead to a great amount of hostility within the community. However, I do not believe that is the sole reason that the game was removed from Steam due to these complaints. As we already discussed earlier in the video, the game does violate sections 2 and 6 of the rules and guidelines. While I'm positive there are people who reported the game based on their opinions alone, I don't believe that was the main cause for removal. In addition, the aggressiveness and harassment came from both sides of the community. Case in point, when myself and others made their Steam reviews and or videos, we were bombarded by members of the community that didn't agree with us, and in many cases there were needless insults thrown around and claims were made that had no basis whatsoever. Such as we already discussed, people seem to think that I don't want sex in games, which isn't the case at all. He then went on to say that it wasn't his impression that Valve didn't want games like that on Steam, or specifically even House Party, more so that they were just ill-equipped to deal with it in the current state of the platform. And of course, that's what we just talked about earlier in this video. He then goes on to suggest maybe a place for games like House Party to be on Steam in a separate little space. And again, that's pretty much my stance on it as well. Let's get Steam red light rolling. And then it gets into a pretty long-ass paragraph talking about censorship and the idea of sex versus violence in video games. Now, this paragraph to me kind of feels more like the developer responding to the criticism he's gotten from places other than Valve themselves and the majority of the complaints he's received. So let's talk about the difference between sex and violence in games. And for the most part, I do agree with this entire notion that sex and violence don't really have that much of a difference between them, and it is kind of stupid that violence is so accepted in society but sex isn't. However, I don't believe that the sex in House Party is equivalent to the violence in most other games available on Steam. There are of course exceptions to that, and the big reason for that is that most violence depicted in video games is in a very unrealistic scenario, whereas House Party seems to prioritize being as realistic as possible. Violence in movies, TV, and video games is often depicted, but is very rarely realistic. In fact, in at least 95% of these projects, the violence is actually toned down because making it too realistic actually makes people uncomfortable. Even a game like Grand Theft Auto, which is brought up every time that this topic is discussed, it has very unrealistic scenarios despite looking like a realistic world. The events that happen and the things you're allowed to do in Grand Theft Auto are still very unrealistic, especially in comparison to House Party, where most of the quests are things you could feasibly do at a party. So which one of these do you think is more realistic? Grabbing a car and running over copious amounts of people for hours on end with the police doing nothing about it? Or is it finding someone's phone at a party, finding naked photos of them, and forcing them to get naked in private so you don't send them to people? If a game like House Party is going to do that, it needs to be quite obviously satirical, and I don't think they've successfully done that. They've added in some joke lines and things like that, but for the most part, you're just a regular dude doing that to other regular people. And again, it's not like that can't exist, but it definitely isn't equal to the stupid things you do in Grand Theft Auto. And he goes on to say, that being said, I understand where Steam is coming from. They are responding to an alarming societal perception of sex and nudity as something evil. Even more so than murder, genocide, torture, and gore, which is widely accepted and prevalent in most other video games that are offered up on Steam and many other gaming platforms. I'm gonna go out on a limb here, and I'm gonna say that they didn't remove your game from Steam because they don't like that there's sex in it, or that other people didn't like that there's sex in it. That might have had a very small reason to do with it, but the majority of the reason is probably because your game once again, violates the Steam rules and guidelines, specifically number 2, where pornography is not allowed on Steam in its current form. He then says, "I don't agree with Steam's decision, but I respect it. I was hoping that their allowance of the game for well over a month, during which time it's been a top seller, was indicative of Steam stepping forward and acknowledging this hypocrisy and taking a stance on it. But it seems the removal was either a case of the game falling through the cracks, or a response from the pressure of the community members who were very aggressively calling for Steam's removal of the game at the expense of those who enjoy it." So Steam can't really just edit their rules and guidelines overnight. That's something that's going to have to go through a specific process before games like this are allowed on Steam. But it's something that does need to be done, and during that time, games like House Party will probably have to be removed from Steam, because if they're not, then they're violating the Steam rules and guidelines. It's that simple. The fact is that they haven't removed the fun or enjoyment from anyone who's already bought the game. Those 35,000 people that bought your game, like we talked about earlier in the video, they can all still play it. You can still release updates for them as well, and they can enjoy the game and community. Your game was also available on itch.io for years, so it's not like you can't just go there with a giant community you've already amassed and still make a profit. So really, Steam hasn't done anything to impact the people who already bought the game and enjoy it, because they can still take part in both the community and they can play it. He then goes on to say that he's most upset for the people who will now receive a watered-down version of the game, because for some groups, it's not enough to boycott or ignore a product they don't like. They have to ensure that nobody else is allowed to enjoy it also. I'm sure there are people like that who don't want others to enjoy things because they don't personally agree with them, but again, the fact of the matter is you're violating the Steam rules and guidelines. And I'm going to assume that the only thing Steam really wants you to do in the game is to make it so that the game is default censored when you start playing it. So if you want your game on Steam, you have to abide by the rules and guidelines that Steam gives you. That being said, you're more than welcome to have an outside source as a patch so that people can access the adult content if they want to. There's plenty of games on Steam that already do that, and Valve really hasn't taken any action against those games, so it's probably fine. But if you put a game on a platform and you don't adhere to what that platform's standards are, then it shouldn't be a surprise when your game doesn't end up being allowed on that platform. Like, I honestly don't think it's as big of a problem as you're making it, because you already have a censored option in the game, so if you have to put that in as the default way, then just go into the Steam forums and sticky a post that has the official patch to make the adult content happen. Like, it's really not that big a deal. So in summary, Steam needs to have like an adults only section if they're even going to entertain games like this, and I think that's not really that big of a thing to ask, so they should probably get on that right away. At the same time, if your game involves full-on uncensored sex where you jizz on people's faces, you probably shouldn't be surprised when it gets removed from Steam. And maybe people that don't like it don't exclusively like it because it has sex. Maybe they don't like it for other reasons. Those reasons may include, but are not limited to, it's not a very good video game. The puzzles and gameplay are very easy, and/or not incredibly obvious and don't make much logical sense. Or the fact that the map you used is the first thing that pops up when you Google Unity Asset House. I'm just saying, maybe there are other reasons other than people don't like sex in games. But seriously, hashtag Steam Red Light, let's get that thing rolling.